Salvete omnes, and welcome to your first Latin lesson. Now, due to the limited time we have together in person, we're going to do the Latin lessons via what is known as the Pimsleur method. This is where we're going to focus on learning to speak and understand how the language sounds rather than on reading or writing. This might seem rather odd for Latin, considering that it is widely regarded a dead language. But just like how babies learn to speak much earlier than they do to read or write, our brains are much better at memorizing words in conversation than they are at comprehending those same words in a written format. I also found learning languages myself this way to be a lot of fun. With this in mind, how these lessons will work is that once you are taught some words, I will then give you phrases and sentences for you to say in Latin. You'll have a couple of seconds to repeat the phrase correctly before Miss Bailey and I will say the correct phrase in Latin. If you're able to say the correct phrase in Latin before Miss Bailey and me at least 80% of the time, you'll be ready to move on to the next lesson. Please do not worry about saying the wrong thing or taking longer than the time allotted. We all do it at times, and the nice thing about doing the practice this way is you're welcome to go at your own pace and redo lessons if you need to. I do ask, however, that you don't take or look at notes during the lesson. I will always attach a copy of the words we go through in case you would like to look through them later, but for us to really engage the part of the brain that allows us to memorize words, it's important we focus on just listening and speaking the language. A final note before we begin is that, like with all languages, Latin has some pronunciation differences depending on who is speaking. In Latin, the two main pronunciation groups are known as classical Latin pronunciation, which was used from 75 BC to the 3rd century AD, and ecclesiastical Latin. Ecclesiastical Latin pronunciation dates back to the late 8th century AD, was the common language or lingua franca of medieval and early modern upper classes in Europe, and is still used in the Catholic Church, the sciences, music, and law to this day. Classical Latin pronunciation, however, is a lot more helpful if, say, you wanted to go on specifically to study classical civilizations. Pronunciation is mutually intelligible, but it is good practice to use the same pronunciation throughout. So you are used to hearing both, though. Miss Bailey will pronounce things in classical Latin, and I will pronounce them in ecclesiastical. You can use whichever you prefer, and with this in mind, let us begin the lesson. This first lesson will look at speaking about you, me, and others doing things. The phrase we'll start with is Discipula Studet. Say after us. Discipula Studet.
Discipula Studet.
The first word is what we get the word disciple from and means student. The second word is telling us what the student is doing and is quite close to our modern pronunciation. Can you guess what it might be? Now, well done if you worked out it means studies. The translation of this phrase is the student studies. But where did we get the from? Well, in Latin, there isn't a word for the or a. You work out if it is talking about a single person from the context of the sentence. With this in mind, can you say after us this sentence and work out what it means? Poeta Scribit.
Poeta Scribit.
Hopefully, poeta is easy enough to work out as poet. And scribit you might recognize as sounding like modern words such as scribble, scribe, or script. This is because scribit means somebody is writing, and therefore our whole sentence translates to the poet writes. How would you say the student writes? Discipula Scribit.
Discipula Scribit.
What about the poet studies? Poeta Studet.
Poeta Studet.
Let's add someone you know into the equation. To stay on the theme, we'll call them Marcus and Livia, but feel free to use the names of other people in place of this. We'll also introduce the words for and, which is et, and reads, which is legit. How would you say Marcus reads? Marcus legit.
Marcus Legit.
Now say Livia reads and writes. Livia legit et scribit.
Livia legit et scribit.
The student studies and reads. Discipula Studet et Legit.
Discipula Studet et Legit.
Well done. As you can see, when we talk about people in the third person, the sentence is the same as we've practiced for everything so far. This is going to change slightly now as we're going to talk about ourselves. The word for I in Latin is ego. You can remember this as somebody who always thinks of themselves as having a big ego, which is where the word comes from. So far, all the doing words we've touched on ended with a T. We're now going to remove this and place an O in its place. Think of it as the big ego wanting to make everything look and sound like it. How would you then say, I study? Ego studeo.
Ego studeo.
I write. Ego scribo.
Ego scribo.
I read. Ego lego.
Ego lego.
I read and Livia writes. Ego lego et Livia scribit.
Ego lego et Livia scribit.
Now let's look at when you're talking directly to someone. The Latin for you is tu, and like how the big ego turns all the doing words endings to an O, tu is going to change all of the endings to an S. You read. Tu legis.
Tu legis.
You write.
Tu scribis.
You study. Tu studes.
Tu studes.
I read and you write. Ego lego et tu scribis.
Ego lego et tu scribis.
The poet studies and you study. Poeta studet et tu studes.
Poeta studet et tu studes.
I study, you read, and the student writes. Ego studio, tu legis, et discipula scribit.
Ego studeo. Tu legis et discipula scribit.
Great job if you remembered all your correct endings. Before we move on, Latin is a great language for anyone like me who suffers with dyslexia because it enjoys writing or saying things as concisely as possible. When saying or writing a sentence, you do not need to use the specific words for I and you, as the doing words already let us know who is doing it by its ending. To take the last activity as an example, ego studeo, tu legis, et Discipula Scribit makes just as much sense as if you say studeo, legis, et Discipula Scribit. Adding ego and tu generally serve to reinforce a point, but outside of that setting generally should not be added. Before we end, let's add one last doing word or verb to consolidate our learning. Now, as you are learning, let's use that in the phrases. The Latin for learn is Discere. To put it in context, the student learns is Discipula Discit. We get the word discern from this, but I've always remembered it better as you learning through discussion. Using what we've learned so far, what is I learn? Disco.
Disco.
You learn. Discis.
Discis.
The poet reads and you learn. Poeta Legit et Discis.
Poeta Legit et Discis.
I read, study, and learn. Lego, studeo, et disco.
Lego, studeo, et disco.
Marcus writes and Livia studies. Marcus scribit et Livia studet.
Marcus scribit et Livia studet.
You read and the student learns. Legis et Discipula Discit.
Legis et Discipula Discit.
Benefactum. Congratulations on completing your first Latin lesson. The best thing to do when learning a language is a little bit of practice each day. Between now and the next lesson, my best suggestion is to practice on Duolingo to expand your vocabulary and come back to this lesson if you need a refresher. Latin is such a fun and beautiful language to learn, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next lesson.